Nicole Brown Simpson bought any Arras lights and gave them to O.J. Simpson. There is no such witness because it didn't happen. And the rest of it is speculation and theory on their part. Cynical speculation, I might add, to try to rush to judgment and win at any cost. Now, you heard during Mr. Darden's effective argument last night a lot of statements. And just before I get to that part, let me say a couple other things about Mr. Rubin. Might be appropriate. Remember, Mr. Rubin's an interesting witness. When he was brought back out here this last time, he was asked, well, look, how many glove manufacturers are there in the world? I mean, he acknowledged there are over 100. And then Bob Blazer asked him a question, well, you know, how many did you check with? 2. He checked with 2 and then he stopped looking. Because remember, he found out that this Brosser stitching could be made on Singer sewing machines. Some of you may know more about that than I do, but they stopped making them after a period of time. But he stopped looking after a period of time, never called anybody else. And that's interesting because that compares the way the prosecution witnesses have conducted themselves throughout. Compare the fact that he stopped looking after 2 with Agent Martz, who finds 3 of the 4 things you need to find EDTA on the sock and the back gate. Rather looking carefully for the characteristic, the 4th one, he stopped searching. He uses a far less discriminating test. Consider the EAPB found under Nicole Brown Simpson's fingernails, where they try to come in and tell you it's a degraded BA. And on cross-examination again, Blazer got Matheson to admit there was no specific support in any of the literature for a BA degrading to a B, and this was, by all accounts, a double-banded B. The reason they didn't want to pursue that? Because she may have scratched somebody with a B type. But they never pursued those things. The second had it Bundy. The Bundy location inside. When the defense investigator finds this hat, nobody wanted to collect it. They refused, in fact, to collect it. When we, in this trial, before you, discovered that evidence had been moved at Bundy, and that a key piece of evidence, the piece of paper, had disappeared, they didn't do anything to find out about it that we know of. We're concerned about those kinds of things. But it's important then when you look at Rubin, because you put him along with the other prosecution witnesses and the things that they've had to say. I told you about that Bloomingdale's receipt. I told you about Brenda Vimage who came in. One other thing about Brenda Vimage that was interesting, she was a lady who, that was the day, I won't forget that day ever probably, because that was the day that, she's a pretty tough witness. I was just trying to talk about receipts and things. She's pretty tough. And I was asking some questions. And remember, we asked her the question, well, who's the lady, who's the person, who's the salesperson for this? And that lady, whose name was Hollings or something like that, was in this building. And they never called her of that receipt. They didn't have to call her, but we know she was here because Brenda Vimage told us about that. We also learned something else about these gloves, that even in extra large, there's probably 3 different sizes. There's the undersize, the standard, and the oversize. And it depends what lot you get. That's what it boils down to, ladies and gentlemen. We know that. That makes sense, doesn't it? And so when you look at everything regarding these gloves, by the way, the lady's name was Helena Phipps, P-H-I-P-P-S. She was in the courthouse and, of course, was never called by the prosecution. She was the actual sales clerk. But I think that the important thing about these gloves that Mr. Rubin was helping us with, in a couple of the pictures of the photographs of the gloves, Mr. Simpson obviously had a heat pack on his hands inside the gloves. You could see the heat pack. If you've lived in cold weather, you know about that. And try, though they will, about shrinking, and they're going to show you, gee, it's raining out there, and they're doing all those things. Isn't that preposterous? They'll do anything to try to contort and distort the facts. Try to get away from that tactical mistake, showing you the gloves didn't fit. So spend all this time on that, and the gloves still don't fit. Rubin can't help you. Rubin is biased. Can't find those gloves because O.J. Simpson's never had those gloves. For them to say otherwise is rank speculation. Now, as I said with Mr. Darden, we heard a lot of information about this so-called domestic discord that he talked about last night and today. And you know, we've been told in this case over and over again that you are to do your job devoid of sympathy or passion or emotion. And I dare say you are very, very intelligent people. And it is very, very hard for any of us to sit here, have to look at photographs of dead bodies, people who did not deserve to die. This case is about who committed these crimes. Not trying to make you and the audience cry about what happened back on June 12th. So they can do it over and over again. But it's not going to work because you understand. This case is not about trying to appeal to your emotions. This case is about the facts and whether these facts establish guilt or innocence beyond a reasonable doubt. You all understand that. So we heard last night, and we're treated to this morning, some very, very interesting observations by my learned colleague, Mr. Darden. Let me start off by sharing with you, and I'll use his board on evidence of other crimes. Now, this is interesting because Mr. Darden started off by saying, well, you know, we're going to put together this other piece. It's not really one of the elements of the crime of murder, motive, but we're going to talk to you about motive now. We're going to tell you and convince you about the motive in this case. And then he spent a long time trying to do that. As I said, he did a fine job in trying to address the facts and conjure up a lot of emotion. But you notice how at the end he kind of petered out of steam there, and I'm sure he got tired, but petered out because this fuse he kept talking about kept going out. It never blew up, it never exploded. There was no triggering mechanism. There was nothing that would lead you to that. It was a nice analogy. It was almost like that baby analogy of the baby justice in the house of fire. You don't have to go through any house of fire. You just have to keep your eyes on the prize, and the prize is justice. It's a city called Justice, and it's a journey that you're leading toward. That's all you got to do. And so this is what this is all about. It's evidence of other crimes. And the court, Mr. Darden kind of looked at this and said, oh, Judge, well, whatever, limited purpose. But let's talk about the limited purpose for which all of his argument was about. When they talk about this evidence of other crimes, such evidence was received, excuse me, sir, and may be considered by you only for the limited purpose of determining if it tends to show a characteristic method or plan or scheme about identity or motive. For the limited purpose for which you may consider such evidence, you must weigh it in the same manner as you do all other evidence in the case. You are not permitted to consider such evidence for any other purpose. So this isn't about character assassination of O.J. Simpson, which you might think at first blush. This is about Mr. Darden trying to conjure up a motive for you. And at the outset, let me say that none, not one little bit of domestic violence is tolerable between a man and a woman. O.J. Simpson is not proud of that 1989 incident. He's not proud of it. But you know what? He paid his debt to that. He went to court. He went through that program. And the one good thing, and no matter how long Darden talked, from 1989 to now, there's never any physical violence between O.J. Simpson and Nicole Brown Simpson. And those are the facts. He kept going back and forth to 85, 89, 93, but there's no physical violence. In fact, let's look at the incidents that he talked about just quickly. And keep this in mind, this is supposedly for the limited purpose of determining if it tends to show a common scheming plan, identity, or motive. Only for that limited purpose. So keep that in mind. He didn't bother reading all this to you. Let me read you something else again that goes along with this as we consider this evidence. The court's already instructed you about motive. And I listened very carefully as my friend read this. He got to one part and he stopped, but I want to read you the rest of it. Motive is not an element of the crime charged and need not be shown. However, you may consider motive or lack of motive as a circumstance in this case. Presence of motive may tend to establish guilt. He stopped after that last night. I'll read you the rest of it. Absence of motive may tend to establish innocence. You will therefore give its presence or absence, as the case may be, the weight to which you feel or find it is entitled. Now, I want to go ahead and read you the part about absence of motive in this case. Because as long as he stood up here and tried to talk to you, couldn't show any physical violence after 1989. He could talk about 1985, the incident involving the Mercedes. Mr. Simpson wasn't arrested then. He can talk about 1993. And certainly, you'd hate to think that two people could have an argument like that, but there was no physical violence. In fact, the police came out, if you recall, and did some further taping. These people were upset and they were arguing, but they never fought on this occasion. There were no blows on this occasion. And certainly no one wants you, if you think in your background, would not want your worst argument ever tape recorded. O.J. Simpson had perhaps his worst argument tape recorded. And then he had the audacity to stand up here and say, well, they didn't call Lenore Walker. We didn't call Lenore Walker because it wasn't necessary. They could have called her. Talked about her having some tests that showed that Mr. Simpson was not antisocial, had no antisocial personality. That wasn't true. Why didn't he call her? Because you don't have to call all witnesses. Just like he said, at some point, all of us, I think, got the message. There are certain horrors of sequestration. I dare say we could still be trying this case, left to our own devices. Somebody had to have some good sense in this courtroom. We had to bring this matter to a close. We did what we set out to do, to demonstrate to you reasonable doubt. We think we've done that. We could call a lot more witnesses that I talked to you about in opening statement, but I don't think that's necessary. Another word about opening statement. In opening statement, I stood before you, and I told you this is what we expect to show. This is not evidence. That was in January. This is what I would hope the evidence would show. If there's a witness that I didn't feel was credible, or we didn't feel was credible, I wouldn't call that witness. If there's a witness who was not available, we wouldn't call that witness. If we didn't feel a witness was necessary, we wouldn't call that witness. The defense doesn't have to prove anything. We've done that in this case, prove things, however, but we don't have to prove anything. So the witness wasn't called. Don't hold that against O.J. Simpson. You hold that against me, and I don't think you can hold that against me because the defendant doesn't have to prove anything. And remember, the judge has already instructed you as follows. Let me read it to you again so we make this clear. Maybe Mr. Darden will remember this. The prosecution has the burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt each element of the crimes charged in the information, and that the defendant was a perpetrator of any such crimes, such charged crimes. The defendant is not required to prove himself innocent or to prove that another person committed the crimes charged. Well, that law is not just for O.J. Simpson. That's the law of the state of California for everyone, and they know it. I told you at the beginning, in this search for truth, in your courage, we cannot let them turn the Constitution on its head. I am going to be your reminder of that. So continuing on, he talks about what might sound like character assassination over and over again about these incidents of controlling and jealous rage, and just because he says that supposedly makes it so. Isn't it interesting? 17 years these folks were married. Had two beautiful kids, a beautiful life. Think they had any good times together? Think they ever want to talk about any of the good times? Think about even after 93. Remember, they got a divorce in their chart in 1992. They tried to get back together. Dr. Christian Reichardt told you It wasn't O.J. Simpson. It was Nicole Brown Simpson who asked to get back together in 1993. They tried to work it out for about a year. They didn't live together, but they tried to work it out. They talked about this. They tried to date exclusively. They tried to salvage a 17-year marriage. And you could understand that. It was her idea. It didn't work out. And they went their separate ways. The evidence is he'd been dating Paula Barberi back in 1992 for almost a year. But when he got back with his wife in April or May of 93, he stopped dating her. When he broke up with his wife again, he started dating her again. He wanted to give it a fair shot. Remember Arnell Simpson said they would wake up sometimes in the morning and Miss Nicole Brown Simpson would be over there with the kids at the house. This was during this period of time. They were trying to get back and get along. They all went to Cabo San Lucas. They had a good life together. It's interesting how the prosecution doesn't want to talk about that at all. In their cynical view of life, they two or three incidents and say, this just tells us the whole picture. Well, all of us, there's more to the entire picture. And I ask you rhetorically this question: who would know O.J. Simpson better? His mother Eunice, his sister Shirley, his sister Carmelita, his daughter Arnell, or Marcia Clark and Chris Darden? Who do you think knows him when they stand up here and talk about his public persona and he's got this dark side? Those are all just words. He's a human being and he's not perfect. He's not proud of some of the things he did, but they don't add up to murder. There's no escalation of force and violence throughout 1989. It's not there. We don't have to call Lenore Walker. Your common sense tells you this. And then he goes into this kind of make-believe fantasy world where he's going to try to tell you on June 12th, he's going to conjure up this rage. June 12th. Very interesting day, isn't it? It's wonderful that we live in the age of videotape, because he tells you about how O.J. Simpson was. Cindy Garvey was telling you how O.J. Simpson was. He was this mean, dark, brooding person at this concert, that he was going to kill his ex-wife because he didn't like his seats. I guess that was what it was about, that he didn't like his seats, or because he didn't invite her to dinner. And can you imagine that? That's how silly what they're talking about is in this case, as he tries to play out this drama. But let me show you, rather than talk. A picture is worth 1,000 words. So let me show you this video. You watch this video for a moment, and we'll talk about it. This is for Chris Darden. You'll recognize some of the people in this photograph after a while. There's Mr. Simpson kissing Denise Brown, kissing Miss Juditha Brown. It's Mr. Lewis Brown. He's talking to a friend. That's his son Justin, and he kisses. Smiling and happily waving. Mr. Brown's happy. Laughing, falling down, laughing again, bending over laughing. Now you see that. You see that with your own eyes. You'll have that back in that jury room. How does that comport with this tortured, twisted reasoning that he was angry in some kind of a jealous rage? He's in a jealous rage like that to you? Your eyes aren't lying to you when you see that. Thank heaven we have videotape. I didn't tell you about that in the opening statement. Think that's pretty compelling? Thank heaven we have that. And we know in this city how important videotapes can be when people don't want to believe things, even when they see it on videotapes. And you saw that yourself. So when you're back there, somebody tries to tell you there was some kind of jealous rage on June 12th. Look at O.J. Simpson interacting with the Brown family and everyone else. Doesn't fit, doesn't make any sense. He isn't brooding. He's not angry. He kisses these family members. He's laughing and joking. He's playing with his son, Justin. Those are the facts. Not what I made up. These are items that don't fit. And if you want to go a little bit further, let's talk about what we know about him that evening. That video is what, about 6 o'clock in the evening? Let's start at 6 o'clock on June 12th. We know he had a good day that day. He had a good week. We'll talk about part of the week in her demeanor, but let's just talk about that part of the evening. 6 o'clock, he's at that recital. You know, you go to a recital because you're proud of your child. You know, and at these recitals, and you all can think back, and those of you who don't have kids will live for this day, you know, these programs are long. Your child is like 33 or 34th on the program. You love everybody else's child, but sometimes you don't want to sit there doing the whole thing, you know. We're told some stuff about he moved a chair around. You ever been in an auditorium where you can move chairs around? Most auditorium seats are like those. You can't move those seats around. This is preposterous. Mr. Darden wasn't in that auditorium. And even after that video, like any proud papa, you know what O.J. Simpson did? Took a picture, a photograph, with his daughter. Let's look at this photograph for a minute. You want to see how he looks while he's in this murderous rage, while this fuse is going on that Darden talks about? Where's the fuse now, Mr. Darden? Where's the fuse? Look at that look on his face. Like any proud papa, he's proud of that little girl. And who wouldn't be proud of her? This is post the dance recital. She has the flowers. Apparently he went out and bought for her. He's standing there with her. The photograph's taken. There's no way of knowing. He would have no way of knowing that would be important. He'd have no way of knowing that Chris Darden someday would stand before you and try to make you believe that that man was in a murderous rage at that same time, and that we would bring forward that picture so you would see it with your own eyes, so you'd understand. What exhibit is that, Mr. Douglas, sir? Look on the back of it. Oh, it's a smaller one. Okay. We'll get that for you, Your Honor. So thank heaven again for the visual. A photograph is worth 1,000 words. So he could speak 1,000 words, and I could show you one photograph. He could speak 1,000 more words, and I can show you that video. And what it does is it puts the lie to this theory about some kind of murderous rage. But we don't just stop there. We didn't just stop there, because this is serious business. A man's life is at stake. So what do? We talked to Gigi Guerin, who's housekeeper. O.J. Simpson, by and large, has a great relationship with all the women in his life. And you've met a number of them. Gigi Guerin is the housekeeper. So she came in here, and the great witness said that she was at Knott's Berry Farm on June 12th. She was out with her family. And at 8 o'clock, she wanted to stay over because she's due to come home that evening. She said, "Can I stay over?" And Mr. Simpson says, "Yes, you may." And so I asked her, "How did he sound to you?" He sounded like Mr. O.J. Simpson always sounds. The employer that she knows, the relationship that she has with him. You saw her. You observed her. You saw her go through cross-examination. She seemed believable to you? 8 o'clock? I think so. I think you'll find so. And then we know that at 9 o'clock, he talked to Christian Reichard, his friend, Dr. Christian Reichard. And you saw Chris Reichard come in here and talk to you. I thought he made a very, very, very good witness from a standpoint of what he had to say. He told you that O.J. Simpson sounded even happier than usual. He's more jovial. He got his life like together, and he was moving on. Now, isn't that interesting? Isn't that an interesting way of looking at circumstantial evidence? Let me show you how we differ in this case. The doctor witness comes in and says O.J. Simpson is jovial at 9 o'clock on June 12th. Pretty good evidence, wouldn't you say? I think you'd love to have that. Anybody would in the case where you're supposedly in a murderous rage. Instead of Chris Darden standing here and saying, "Well, you know, that's pretty tough evidence for us to overcome," he says O.J. Simpson was happy because he was going to kill his wife. Now, if you believe that, I suppose I might as well sit down now, and I'm probably wasting my time. I don't think any of you believe that. That is preposterous. It flies in the face of everything that is reasonable. If you have these two reasonable hypothesis. His isn't even reasonable, but extremely reasonable. You'd have to adopt this, that he's jovial, he's happy. They make a date for that next Wednesday when O.J. Simpson returns from back east. You remember that? That's the testimony. Now, Mr. Darden tries to make a big thing of the fact, well, gee, you know, golly, was he depressed about the fact that they had broken up or they finally broken up? He said, yeah, he'd been down. I don't think he never said he was depressed, that he was down or upset. And who wouldn't be? Remember the last questions I asked? If you had just ended a 17-year relationship, it was over, you feel down. For a short period of time, you got your life on. You wouldn't go kill your ex-wife, the mother of your children. O.J. Simpson didn't try to kill or didn't kill Nicole Brown Simpson when they got a divorce, when they went through whatever settlement they went through, when Faye Resnick moved in, when any of these things, none of these things happened. Because of their rush to judgment, they have to try to come up with some kind of a motive that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't stop with just Christian Reichardt and what he had to say. And of course, I have his testimony also about what he said. He talked about the demeanor of the various people he talked about, but most importantly, he talked about O.J. Simpson's demeanor and how it was that night and how he appeared to be. Let me just read you this part here. This is 42537, counsel. Question. Now, with regard to the statement about whether or not you talked about Miss Nicole Brown Simpson, that was not the thrust of any of that conversation, was it? Answer, not at all. It wasn't on his mind. This time he's talking about getting ready to go to McDonald's. In fact, do you recall that Mr. Simpson had said that to you, that he was out of the loop, that he was glad to be out of the loop, that he'd gotten his life together with his new lady? Remember him telling you that? Answer, that's correct. And who was that new lady? Answer, Paula Barbieri. Let me just take a moment about Paula Barbieri. One of the most outrageous things I heard yesterday was this wild speculation that O.J. Simpson had some kind of falling out with Paula Barbieri on that Sunday. Where is the evidence of that? I mean, that's preposterous. The evidence is quite to the contrary. Remember when O.J. Simpson came back into town on Friday, first person who met him and they spent the evening together was Paula Barbieri. And it was interesting because I was having trouble hearing her. She said, I stayed at the house till one of you reminded me, she said, till I went to the prayer meeting. That's where she left. They'd been together that day. And then on the very next day, they went to this dinner in support of Israel. And I guess Mr. Douglas can show us that. This is that dinner. I guess he's really working up that murderous rage that day with those little ladies that he's with. They seem to be really happy to be taking a picture with him. Had no idea we'd ever have to use this to show, to counterbalance this specious, cynical, speculative theory that he's had some kind of a time fuse. But that photograph, again, demonstrates that. And then we have the testimony of the lady who was there, Carol Connor, about what she called that exquisite moment. And I suppose that she's an artist. You could tell by the way she was dressed when she's here, and she's written this Academy Award-winning love tune, and I guess she sees things maybe that we don't quite see, but she said it was an exquisite moment between O.J. Simpson and Paula Barbieri as they were in each other's arms at that particular dinner. Remember, she told you that. Was he thinking about Nicole at that point? Only in Chris Darden's mind. Not in yours, not anything else reasonable. And so you have, again, these photographs and these word pictures, which I think amply destroys this. So he continues on about Paula Barbieri. He says, you knew about Paula Barbieri, isn't that correct? Yes, I did. Also, Mr. Simpson had told you that he began dating Paula Barbieri on a regular basis, isn't that correct? Answer, yeah. And that you had said and indicated to the police in an interview that Mr. Simpson seemed to like Paula a lot and seemed happy, or at least happier, than he had been before once he was with Paula. Isn't that correct? That's correct, yes. That's what you told the police, isn't it, sir? That's correct. When you talked to the police, Dr. Reichardt, were you telling them the truth? Answer, absolutely. And when you are coming here today to testify to this jury, are you telling them the truth? Answer, absolutely. And so Once again, I haven't tried to speculate. I've read to you what the witness said. Now what about this thing that Darden keeps talking about that he knows isn't so, that the police have been out there 8 times on so-called domestic discord cases? They told you that a whole bunch of times. And this is why you have to look with some suspicion at what the prosecutors tell you in this case. Remember Officer Farrell? The officer who was a sergeant, I believe, who after the '89 incident went back to the station to try and check and see whether or not there'd ever been any other incidents where any of the police officers in that division in West Los Angeles had been called. You check your notes. And so what he did was he had occasion to check for other domestic discord incidents. This becomes rather important later, as you're going to see. So he talks to us. He says, the question is, all right, so you talked to some officers. How many? Just tell me in number, how many officers did you talk to altogether? Answer, I can't recall. Maybe 10. And did you take any reports from any of those officers? Answer, I requested, if they had any information, to write out a report and give it to me. Question, and you got a report from one officer, did you not? Answer, that's correct. Question, and that officer's name is Mark Furman. Question, that's correct. And was that the only written report that you received? So now, when Darden stands up here and talks to you about these 8 incidents or whatever where there's nothing happened, they checked with at least 10 of the police officers in that division. Nobody had any recollection of anything of going out there. Now, we know from Ship, the police would stop by there. We know that. Ship told us that. There's some photograph and evidence of O.J. Simpson with Ship and maybe some other police officers. That was a place they would stop by on occasion. But this, to tell you 8 to 10 times, they know that was their own witness, Farrell. Then he has the audacity to tell you about stalking. He tells you in opening statement, he's going to tell you and show you O.J. Simpson was stalking Nicole Brown Simpson. Now, this is the prosecutor. He proved one incident of stalking? Absolutely not. In fact, yesterday, when he stood up here and told you about O.J. Simpson looking in the window of Nicole Brown Simpson's house, I was somewhat dismayed. So I thought, gee, I better get the transcript out again, since the record is the best evidence, not what they say. Because they say it so, isn't so. They said that themselves. And so we talked about this. And you remember Mr. Colby? Colby and Co., 2 people who lived next door to Nicole on Gretna Green. Remember them? You remember those 2. And Mr. Colby was testifying on this date. It's 13176. I saw him observe the residence next door, then walk around the corner, which would be southerly, then westerly on Shetland, and go back around again and look again at the residence. Well, let me just stop you there, all right, so that it is clear. When you first saw the man who was on the sidewalk 5 feet from Nicole Brown's driveway, there's an objection? Yes. Then he walked in a southerly direction, then back around the corner. Our house is on a corner like this, indicating. He then went southerly and then westerly and then back around again. Okay. Did he walk back to the same spot he was in when you saw him initially? Yes, he did. And he goes on to talk about him walking within 5 yards of Nicole Brown Simpson's driveway and then walks back. And you remember this was the incident where Mr. Colby said he was embarrassed because he saw this black man in Brentwood and he called the police. And then he found out it was O.J. Simpson. Now, nowhere are you going to find in that testimony O.J. Simpson was up looking in a window or stalking anybody. He was on the sidewalk out there, presumably waiting for his wife or the kids to come home, and then he left. That's how the people have twisted and turned things in this case. That becomes his incident of stalking. And when you go back, you look at this evidence, and I know you're going to be fair and honorable. You look at this and you'll see. You'll make short work of this. You'll make short work of an emotional argument that was very emotional. but it doesn't add up. It doesn't fit. It wasn't factual. It's for a limited purpose. And here may be the coup de grace. All of these things are supposedly for motive, to show how somebody might have acted on June 12th. Interesting, isn't it? Again, in the words of Shakespeare, they are hoisted by their own petard. They talk about these incidents involving Nicole and Mr. O.J. Simpson. Every time they would have an argument, everybody would know about it, whether it was in '89 or the '93. Everybody would know about it because it would be loud. They'd be arguing back and forth. There was drinking on the time in '89, January 1st. Remember what the evidence was? They'd both been drinking. It certainly doesn't make it right, but they were loud arguments where everybody knew about it. What kind of characteristic is that in this case? This is a case about stealth. This is a case about somebody who, it seems to me, is a professional assassin who kills these two people. And the thing that is so outrageous, for them to stand here and tell you that this is all about Nicole Brown Simpson. Have any of you thought during the last year, what if the perpetrators were after Ron Goldman and that envelope that he had in his hand that Dr. Lee found that smear on? Who in this courtroom would know? The rest is speculation. This is their theory that they tried to come up with. We don't know. This is a case of reasonable doubt. This is a case of an innocent man wrongfully accused. They can't answer those questions. No one can under these circumstances. And so we move on and look at other things that don't fit. We know that there was this terrific struggle involving primarily Mr. Goldman as he fought for his life. Why no bruises on Mr. Simpson's body here? Admittedly, this was a violent struggle involving two very, very fit adults. And let's look briefly at the bruises on Mr. Goldman's hands. I don't think we have to cut the feet on this, Your Honor, I don't believe. We talked about this in the opening statement. That large bruise on the knuckle, according to Dr. Baden and others, is consistent with Mr. Goldman's fight that he put up for his life. He struck something, probably a person at that point. But Ms. Clark and the others can't even admit that. In the face of doctors, a doctor who did the re-autopsy, re-examination of the death involving Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy, tells you one thing. The prosecutors say, oh, no, he must have been flailing back, must have hit his hand against a tree or something like that. Only the facts that they want to put into this little contorted theory. But we prove to you otherwise. We prove to you what's reasonable under the circumstances. So I think you saw that in my opening, and I think that is further evidence this was a very, very real fight. And of course, in a real fight, in real life, fights are awkward and clumsy. Oftentimes the combatants are rolling around the ground. And one of the very interesting things in this case is this dugout area near Mr. Goldman's body. The feet should be cut. This area I thought was very, very interesting. You remember I asked Detective Lang about this, and this is going to become very, very important later on. See this area, this dugout area? Remember there's the pager over there, and there's this dugout area. That gives you some idea of the ferocity of this altercation that took place. Remember Dr. Henry Lee talked about the blood all around in this area, the keys one place, the beeper someplace else. This dugout area. Interesting, isn't it? Now think with me for a moment. If you fought for 5 to 15 minutes in an area like that, I suppose both parties would have a lot of bruises and marks on them, wouldn't they? Mr. Goldman did, and I bet you his perpetrator does. But there's something else again. They want to tell you, and you'll hear a lot about socks before we're finished, that these socks that all of a sudden appear to that video, the foot of his bed, were being worn by Mr. O.J. Simpson. Well, ladies and gentlemen, when you see these socks, what do you think the dirt and dust was on these socks? Now let's see if they can ever explain this. Where was the dirt that was thrown up and moved around on these socks? You're not going to see any. You're not going to see any dirt because those socks weren't there. You see that dirt? You see that dugout? You remember this photograph. What number is this, Mr. Douglas?
83, Your Honor.
You remember this when you talk about this case and you wonder whether or not there's a reasonable doubt, whether or not this is an innocent man wrongfully accused. And so you look at this. When you expect, common sense would tell you there'd be bruises and nicks, being kicked, there'd be marks on all the perpetrators. With the heavy foliage there, with the fence and the trees, you would expect scratches on everyone. Whereas Mr. Goldman has more than 30 stab wounds, you would expect this struggle, 5 to 15 minutes, to have left that. But there's nothing like that in this case. Nothing like that on Mr. Simpson's body. You've seen that before and you'll see it again. Now, in this case, in this case, in opening statement, I showed you with Bob Shapiro's foresight and wisdom. He had these photographs taken, I think, on June 15th. Instead of praising this lawyer who was interested in the truth, prosecution says, well, they went to Dr. Heisinger. That wasn't really his doctor. Isn't that preposterous? Dr. Heisinger, by all accounts, is a qualified doctor. He was the Raiders team doctor. So I suppose he's qualified. And this is Mr. O.J. Simpson's body as it appeared on June 15th. Would you expect to see a lot of bruises and marks on that body? See his back? Some of these aren't very flattering, but this is not about flattery. This is about his life. Now on his hands. There's some slight abrasions on his hands, but nothing consistent with a fight like this. You know it, I know it, we all know it. And we'll talk more about this so-called fish hook cut and where he got that. It'll become very clear when we talk about demeanor, where that came from. Ms. Clark wants to try to confuse that, but that's very, very clear. And so with regard to Mr. Simpson's physical condition, I want to just tell you to take my word to stand there and say, oh, he was in great shape on that day, or he looked good or whatever. Fortunately, we had photographs again. We had graphic evidence of this man's body. This man had not been in a life and death struggle from 5 to 15 minutes. Ms. Clark herself said it. She used a boxing analogy, saying that a boxer's fight for 3 minutes per round. Sometimes it's a knockout in the first round, but in this instance, we know because of the way the injuries were and the blood, this lasted for this period of time. This was a violent struggle. That man that you saw up there was not involved in that violent struggle. And so we did call, Bob Shapiro called Dr. Robert Heisinger as a witness in this case. And you recall that Dr. Heisinger was a very, very, seemed to me a very credible, honest witness. What did he say? He said that O.J. Simpson looks like Tarzan, but he moves more like Tarzan's grandfather. That's not to say that O.J. Simpson wouldn't be capable of committing a crime. It's never what we were trying to say. What we were trying to say was that see this man for who he is. See this man for the arthritis that he suffers. That everybody in his family suffers with arthritis. You saw his mother, you heard his sister, and you heard he has it worse than they have. Now, you can still play golf. You can still do that. And some of you, I hope, don't, but if you have in the early stages, you know what it is, certainly on certain days. What I think it means is you don't go out looking for anybody to be in an altercation with. O.J. Simpson, by all accounts, has trouble with lateral movement, from moving from side to side, because you saw when I had him come over here, those knee operations that basically spelled NFL, National Football League, 4 or 5 times on the left knee, maybe a couple times on the right knee. That's the price that a running back pays. And while I'm talking about running backs, wasn't it interesting yesterday that Ms. Clark in our argument says O.J. Simpson was a football player. And he has to run through the line. And he has the killer instinct. Is that really stretching it, ladies and gentlemen? O.J. Simpson hasn't played football for 15 years. Man's 46 years old now. He's not going to run with anything anymore. But she didn't know much about sports, does she? Because a running back avoids trying to be hit. That's what he does. The problem with them, they don't block. They always run. They try to get out of the way. So he's not looking for contact. He gets tackled. But running backs don't try to run over anybody, only like maybe Jim Brown or somebody like that. The rest of them run out of bounds. So, I mean, they grab at everything. Killer instinct. Played football 15 years ago, and he was the best at what he did. He won the Heisman Trophy, according to his daughter, the day she was born. Emblematic of the best football player in America. And so, this was brought to you only to give you some further factors about who this man is, what limitations, if any, he has, to give you a complete picture of who he is. Now we shift our attention to Mr. O.J. Simpson's demeanor, and I want you to examine with me the conduct both before and after June 12th, 1994, and the manner in which this man reacted and handled himself. You'll remember, and let's start off with the week before. We could have gone further back. You know from the evidence that he travels all the time. He hardly has any time to have any fuse for anything. He's never here. He's always traveling for Hertz. He's doing something with sports. He's not here. This particular week was typical of the kind of weeks he has, it seems. He was here on Monday. On Tuesday, he and Paula Barbieri got together and met with this interior designer who'd done work on his house before. She brought out that he's done other work on that house to change the bathroom around and do some other work. She had a budget, and they gave her a check. Now, it's so interesting, isn't it? You change your house or get some work done. Mr. Darden says that's to get Nicole out of the house. Is that stupid? I mean, does that make any sense to you? That's preposterous. Man's moved on with his life. He's having some work done, some interior decorating work done. We prove that. You can't see the positive side of that. O.J. Simpson, a check for Collins & Collins, was Mary Collins. June 7th, $1,000. That was a down payment on the work she was going to do. Again, you saw her. You saw her come in. This work was to be done. They wanted to do it, and Paula Barbieri played a role and a great part in that work. After that, he was on the road. Went back east to play golf with Jack McKay, and you saw Jack McKay. And you remember they were golf buddies. It was a Hertz thing, or not a Hertz thing. This was this association of retired or something or other. Played golf. But the most important thing I thought was Mr. McKay indicated that, and there was the foursome, Mr. McKay indicated that he observed Mr. Simpson walking and walking with a limp. You'll recall that. And then we came to the Carol Connor dinner, where Carol Connor observed the magic moment on this Saturday. And then we called witnesses from the family. And just before we take the dinner break, let's talk briefly about these witnesses from the family and what they had to say. We first called Arnell Simpson. And you saw Arnell on the stand. Arnell Simpson, the defendant's daughter, born the day he won the Heisman Trophy. Now, any daughter would be proud and want to testify for her father. But you saw her on the stand. You got a chance to judge her like you do the other witnesses, to observe her credibility and what she had to tell you. She told you that her father always rushed around. Told you something about him, too. And when she got out of college at Howard University, she wanted to come home. He had a place for her to come home to. You know, children go away and they come back a lot these days. And so, Cato Kalin, they make a big thing about Cato Kalin living there. I mean, you know, I choose to think he said something about O.J. Simpson. He didn't know Cato Kalin anything. If he wanted to say, look, I don't want you living with my wife, we're trying to get back together. I suppose a guy could say that if they're trying to get back together. He didn't say that. Let him come and live there in the other guest house. They turned that around to something bad. That's something positive about this man who with such dignity has sat there for all these months. This human being, this Orenthal James Simpson. That tells you something about him. And so his daughter tells you a lot about him. She can tell a lot about a person, I suppose, by their children. It tells you a lot about him and their living together and their life together and what he meant. About how our little brothers and sisters would come over there in the early morning hours after they were trying to get together in 1994 in May. They'd be out by the pool. She'd see him. About the kind of life they had together and the dogs that they purchased and the kind of things they did. Maybe a little bit of the other side of what these incidents they want to talk about in the distant past. The way O.J. Simpson really is and really was. You saw her and you observed her. And she told you how her father reacted when he got the news that his ex-wife had been killed. She told you she had never before heard her father sound like that. How upset he was. How he lost control of himself. How distraught he was. You heard her. You saw her on that stand. That's why we called her, so you'd have a better understanding, because I knew there'd come a day that Marcia Clark would stand here and say, well, you know, he didn't react like somebody does when they get to this information, just like she did yesterday. But what Miss Clark forgot, because I examined Detective Phillips, and you look back through your notes, the first thing that O.J. Simpson said to Detective Phillips was, what do you mean she's been killed? And then he kept repeating himself and repeating himself, and Phillips, to his credit, said he became very, very upset, kept repeating himself, and Phillips gave the phone to Arnell Simpson. So she can again theorize, fantasize all she wants. Well, he didn't ask if it was a car accident. You ever had some bad news given to you? There's no book that you go to. The only book you should go to is the Bible or your God, whomever you believe in, to help get you through it. There's nothing that says how you would handle yourself in those times. These prosecutors don't understand that. They would stand here and tell you that that's preposterous. This man was upset. And you're going to see that everything he did from that moment that he found out that his ex-wife had been killed was consistent only with innocence. Absolutely that day. And so Arnell Simpson helps us in that regard. She's followed to the stand by Carmelita Durio. Sister, loves her brother, but you knew that. She was called to talk about Ron Shipp, one of the witnesses in this case that the prosecution called. It's interesting, isn't it, that neither one of the prosecutors wanted to talk about this dream, because I think they're embarrassed by this. They didn't talk about it. They should be embarrassed. A dream. They listed evidence about some dream. Was it a daydream? Was it a night dream? Was it a nightmare? Was he looking out the window? What did it mean? Even the judge, his instruction, you can totally disregard that. You got to figure out, who knows what that means? It probably doesn't mean anything, because Shipp did not tell you the truth. If you listen to Carmelita, if you listen to Shirley, if you listen to Miss Eunice Simpson, Shipp was never alone with O.J. Simpson that night. He was an O.J. wannabe, bringing police officers over there, still wanting to be a police officer, off the force for whatever reason, drinking that night, drinking in the past as he said he was. He's not credible, and the evidence he brings is so unreliable and so irrelevant that I don't want to spend much of your time with it. But you saw it, you heard them. I ask you to consider Carmelita, Shirley, and Eunice as against Ron Shipp, and I ask you who you're going to believe. I think it'll be no contest. And so you remember what Miss Eunice Simpson said when she said that he seemed a bit spacey, was the way she described it. He was never alone, never talked about any dreams. When Shirley went upstairs with her husband, they spent the night with O.J. Simpson. This was a time for family. This was a time where people gathered around. This is the time for people being sad. They sat on the couch with O.J. Simpson holding his mother's hand. You remember that. My mother always told me that you could tell a lot about a person, about how they treat their mother. You probably have heard that too.